Thank you very much, Jose, for your words, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My presentation will be in Spanish. That is the way that I can introduce everything in a more thorough way. It's easier for me. What I will be presenting this afternoon is a scale that we have developed after so many years. It seems quite simple, the scale, but there's been a lot of work behind this and previous investigation and research in this model of scale that I will be referring to. It's really a conceptual model, and it's a scale that, like Jose has indicated, complements the concept of the Ulyssess, and it helps us to really draw close to the practical criteria of the psychosocial reality of immigrants. These are going to be the contents that we will be considering. Those who were here for the lecture yesterday or the day before yesterday, we touched these concepts and spoke about the scale. This is a continuum of the symptoms I've mentioned in regards to the Ulyssess syndrome. We have three basic elements in the scale. And first of all, we have to define the type of griefs. And secondly, we have to identify the intensity of these griefs. It's not the same thing to really suffer a more complicated or extreme grief and take into consideration those factors that are important in considering and we considered this yesterday, and we will briefly talk about this. The type of grief we considered, there's 7 major griefs in migration: the family area, the language, the culture, the grief for the land, with all of the different themes, the smells, the temperature, the weather, the picture of the land of origin, which is very important, and also the social status grief, the work, the documents, the housing, and the grief in regards to the group of peering and the difficulties of integrating in a new country, and also the physical risks that come with the immigrating, not only the migration and immigrating, the journeys and very difficult and hardships and finding a job and having the capacity of finding a solution. And now you're faced with different eating habits as well, that it's a risk for the physical being itself. And like I said, it's important to see these griefs and take in consideration the different intensity of these. It's not the same to immigrate in good conditions or situations. 5 million and 10 millions of dollars, there's a big difference. It's something that you're situations that are able to overcome or manage. Meaning, if you have a debt, a simple grief has nothing to do with an extreme grief because of an extreme situation out of your control. And then 2 main factors that regulate the grief migration, that is the vulnerability and also the weariness, the weakness, and the stressors that the immigrant is facing. So we will be talking about this in detail, but first of all, I wanted to set the elements of scale so that I can explain a little bit more why is it that we use the scale, what are the objectives behind the scale, and then we will go back to the specific development of the scale, and we will focus in why is this the scale, what are the correct characteristics and the objectives, which I think it's very important to take in consideration. These would be the different types of griefs and variables that we will consider within the elements of the scale in combination. And it's a thorough analysis, a specific analysis of interest. Very well, the context in which the scale arises. The scale arises in the new migrations of the 21st century. Migration is always a relevant event in someone's life. If each individual who has migrated, it's something. I would say presently that in the present new migrations, it's very superior, yes, from others. Meaning, if the scale appears now and the scale was not there before, is because migration is now a determining factor in the health and the physical health of an individual. It's always really had an impact, but really now they're living extreme situations. It's not something relevant. It really is a determining factor that one has to, study now this and do. I will say also that the reason why we have the scale is because there's a great demand for an assessment instrument, an assessment tool. Very well, the scale is really a procedure to structurize the information that we receive from the immigrant. The immigrant has a very psychological, emotional, cultural, complex situation. Now you have to structure that in a way that you are able to respond to the immigrant in a specific manner. And so, in a way, in a form, the scale is a way in which we structurize all of this information and feedback that we're getting from the immigrant. So it is information that is related with the grief, and the tale or the story told by immigrants is really of a great phenological value and demographical. And this has really a great value behind it. That is why we need to know how to respond. And we have to really think about our responses in an objective way, not just respond to something, but really try to structurize the information, the relevant social aspect that the immigrant is trying to transmit, and compare this subject in it, this immigrant with another. So really the characteristics of the scale is a part of really the medical record or care information of an individual. Not only the psychological aspect or a medical service or social services or educational services. It's not a scale that is directly for the medical profession. It's a more of a general scale. It really provides us information about the situation of stress of the subject or the immigrant. Very well. The characteristics of the scale really, it screens the different factors. Really, we have to have an open mind that when we are using the scale, it's as if someone is working at an insurance company or a brokerage. A broker has to see the problems and issues that the client is facing to try to help and sell his insurance. Now, we are not doing this because we want the patient to pay us or we're trying to get business out of the patient, but what are his issues? What are the problems he's facing? What are the things that are affecting him, that are causing the stressors or stress? The scale then helps us to really screen the different problems and assess the facts. Really, we have to be very sensible so that we do not let those risk situations just out of our hand. Now, the third characteristic is that the scale is ethic. Yes, the concept of ethic has nothing to do with ethnics. From the linguistic point of view to the pathology, it's really a different perspective from what is ethic, meaning try to go about a situation in a conceptual way, in a scientific way, framework. On the other hand, a subject, according to his way, his point of view of the world. So the scale is a scale that is structured, the framework of a conceptual scheme. Like certain scientific theories try to see the reality that the immigrant is living. So it's really, it accesses the facts with the framework of a conceptual scheme. It's an ethics scale, and also the version of what the immigrant is, what's happening, what he's going through in an objective manner. An anthropologist goes to an island in the Pacific, a very distant island, and he is observing a ritual dance. The whole clan or group is dancing. The anthropologist is probably going to interpret that as a dance, a ritual among the group with a certain objective. But if we ask someone from the group who is dancing, they would say, from their perspective, we are trying to ease the spirits. That is why we are dancing. So you notice there's a different point of view of the subject itself with the anthropologist, which comes from an exterior field. So that is with the scale, the way it's been structured, that we try to see the point of view of the immigrant and study his mental illnesses and the risks that the immigrant might have in the pathological. And the scale does not measure symptoms. Symptoms are another section of the reality. And the interest will be in try to correlate the scale with the symptoms. How do we correlate the risk in which this subject is faced with a mental illness, like we were talking about the fact of delivery and labor? We can see the level of stressors and vulnerability using the scale and correlate that with the symptoms of what a delivery brings, of anguish, of pain, of isolation. Those are symptoms. But if we really reflect on the vulnerability and the stressors of the scale, then we would be able to do the correlation among these. So the scale does not measure symptoms. And the scale is also applied to other situations of chronic stress, as mobbing or burnouts or type of grieveness, and how the subject is vulnerable to those and the stressors, the factors that are causing stress. And the scale is also focusing on migration. Not only is that individual itself facing certain situations, but we also consider that it's really relevant to take in consideration the different services that the individual can take advantage of. And we try to focus on the migration aspect because it's a very relevant issue in the life of the individual. And before talking more about the scale, this is a current version of the development of the initial version presented originally. So what are the objectives of the scale itself? Well, the scale provides us with an assessment criteria regarding the intensity of the factors of mental health risk in the immigrants. And this criteria then will enable us to compare the risk factors of the different cases studied. same criteria to evaluate one case, another case, compare who is in a better position and who is in a worse position. This is very important because this will help us distribute in a more careful and a more equal way the social resources. So if we detect the risk factors to evaluate between one individual and the other, then we will know who is more in need of a certain service. And if we don't use a criteria, then we will not be able to do so. It is important in a context in which we are living in a world with very limited resources to have the capacity of really try to equally provide everybody with the services that they are needing. And another thing which is very important, the scale also helps us eliminate involvement in areas in which no problem is detected. Therefore, we do not have to intervene in those areas in which there is no problem. And in the issue or the area of the mental illness, there's a risk that, we are nobody to say when there is a suffering, a pathology. We don't want to really intrude to a certain point in people's private life and tell them how they must live or how must they do things. That's their personal right. So really eliminate those areas in which no problem is detected and do not intrude in the individual's life. Do not try to be, that God trying to control the life of the individual. And the scale has also been used in different contexts with immigrants when they are arriving at new countries, but we are also using this scale with individuals who have not immigrated yet and are still in their land of origin to see if it will be to their advantage to migrate or not, because they will face difficulties, and so they are able to evaluate if they are able to overcome. And immigrants who have gone back to their land of origin, people that are immigrants from Peru and were in Spain, and now they go back to their land of origin, and how it's affected them psychologically, meaning the scale not only helps us study the immigrant who has immigrated, but also study that one who immigrated and now is back in their place or land of origin and what they face. And like we said yesterday, we have to have a global perspective. We have to understand that today's world, really, we have to look for global answers to a global problem, not only here in this country, but also really work collaboratively with the other countries. So very well, as I've explained, what are the objectives and the different elements and factors that the scale points out. The scale is based in certain theories that we have to take in consideration, so that it's very important to take in consideration if we are taking a picture, we have to make sure that the camera is in good functioning well. We have to have an instrument that helps us analyze in a high quality, in a way that we have the maximum guarantees. So I will briefly say that we have to be very rigorous and thorough in this analysis, the epistemological level and the theoretical level. Why that theory, and if that theory has a scientific level, and if not, we might be measuring an area without the proper instruments. Very well. So the scale is really a model that structures information, like we've mentioned, and the models really are similar representations of objects, of processes, or formal representations. And these models are similar to the rules of correspondence between the theoretical level and the praxis level, the reality level of such magnitude that cannot be compared. So when working with models, we can theorize and have so many theories, but it's hard to prove these. And you can't measure reality because there's so many variables. So the model is really in between for the investigation. The models help overcome the excessive gap between the level of the theories and that of the facts. The theories are abstract conceptualizations that are difficult to compare with reality, and the models are schematizations of aspects of theory closest to the epimerical model and the model concept. For example, a model that is more the reality of the abstract and reality. For example, take a house as an example, and it's huge, has a lot of bedrooms, and the level of theory that is in between from facts or reality. So we can say that it works or functions more as a model or concept used in the architecture involves a mock-up mapper between theory and reality or facts. Therefore, it's very important to really have good theories. And it would be quite lengthy to go into detail explaining this, but I will say, like we will comment later on, the analysis that we do from the scales point of view can only be valid if there is a good theory behind it. Therefore, we have to be very thorough. How are we measuring it? If we fail, then we will not be successful. Therefore, we really have to observe. Observing reality is not a mere objective transcription of events. Reality is not directly observed. We have to have in mind the importance of theory. We really can't we cannot really observe reality in a more thorough or detailed way. In my book, I've explained it in a more thorough way. If you are interested, please speak with Jose. So therefore, our theories on which the scale is based are several theories which have a very important level. The psychoanalytical theory of the grief, there are certain aspects that are more complex, but the psychoanalytical theory is one of the most applicable theories and have given us good results in the clinical work and the cognitive theory of stress, the social psychiatry and psychology, and also the evolutionary psychiatry and psychology, meaning we will try to have a series of powerful tools, very well structured, so we're able to perform this job, this work. It's lengthy to explain all of this, but I think I'd like to explain this. Otherwise, we will not have the potential to continue on with the evaluating method. Therefore, I think it's very important that we take a few minutes to analyze this. Now, if we go back after this talk on these different factors, we go back to the scale and how it works.
So then we are going to talk about the 7 griefs that we have talked about previously. So you mix depressive aspects. There's grief for what was left behind, for what you left in your native country. On the other side, in immigration, there's anxiety, confusion in respect to what's coming up ahead that we cannot control, that we don't know very well. And the answers could be anxiety, feelings of this type, where you're confused, anguished. These are the basic elements when it comes to the level of psychology. As an example, because of the language, you would have to know the loss or the contact with the native language, the suffering. But the woman might not know the language. And the effort would be to learn the language, to understand, to be aware of confused situations. We have to take this into account when the scale is being analyzed. The second pillar of the scale, we saw the griefs. The second pillar would be the intensity of the griefs. And here, like we talked about previously, we distinguish the simple grief. It's the one that we live in one way, and then there's the complicated one, the simple and the complicated one. There are ways, but with effort, with straight effort, you can overcome this. When the problem is just really bad that you're not able to get out of it, then you go into crisis. As an example, the grief for family and immigration, the simple grief, a young boy or an adult, he could go and come back to see his family, doesn't have kids, doesn't have sick parents. It's a vital change that has no risks, a psychological risk. The complicated grief is when you have parents that are sick, little ones. You could go, but it's hard and there's a lot of difficulties. But then it becomes hard because you can't go back. You don't have your documentation. There could be the death of a father and you can't go back to the funeral. All this. So the third pillar that comes in the scale, these two variables that are the ones that we are going to see fundamentally, the vulnerability and the stressors. That is how we refer to them. And how do we answer to these? We understand by vulnerability all of the limitations that the immigrant has, and that these suppose a risk for his isolation. Nobody is perfect. We all have struggles, difficulties, limitations, human limitations. Some have more and some have less. Vulnerability will measure the grade on that struggle. So it's, the immigrant has vulnerability from the beginning when he starts this migration. It is before migration that we try to understand or measure the vulnerability. When the migration closes the door, takes his luggage and takes off, everything that he was before will be vulnerable. If he was sick from the heart, or he's limping, or if he's blind, all these things are needed to be successful in the country where he is going to. We evaluate vulnerability independently, each one of the 7 griefs. We can't correlate them where we believe that there are situations that are different. Just as you see at the very bottom, we distinguish between simple vulnerability, complicated vulnerability, and extreme vulnerability. Within the same criteria, we apply grief, we apply vulnerability. What is vulnerability? Simple limitations, nobody's Superman. There's some things. The complicated one is when the problems that we have are very important, and we are going to have hardship in migration. Somebody who's sick from the heart, that migrates with total deafness. This is all very important. But if he has the means, if he has the resources, he could elaborate on that. That would be the complicated vulnerability. This would be a person that he doesn't know anything, or with a disability of walking. There are extreme things that hinder the power of having success of the projects up ahead. So there's vulnerability, the simple one, and then the complicated one. Logically, we have indicators to measure with all detail when we talk about simple. And that's why we put examples. This all has to have small readings. What are stressors? The stressors are those difficulties which a person encounters on immigration when he arrives to the country where he arrived. This is the moment where he has closed the door behind it. All the other problems that come ahead are the stressors. Documentation, family members, his culture. These are all the obstacles that he's going to have after he has left home. To all that we call stressors. Of course, we are going to talk about stressors above all for those that are a risk to mental health, because we're evaluating mental health. That is the objective. As I mentioned before, these are evaluated independently for each one, where we have the language one, the work, the social status. These could be different one from the other. So we utilize the same system. Simple stressors, small difficulties that everyone has. Nobody arrives to our country and everything is all done for them. The richest person in the world, it's not that way. The person doesn't know the language, there's difficulties. If one arrives in good conditions, then the person overcomes that easily. The complicated stressors would be when the immigrant is bound with the previous problems, he's working overtime, the structure of the family, all these type of situations are difficult, but with effort he's able to overcome them. And we will call these stressors extreme ones. Those that the immigrant he cannot control, they are tremendous walls, big walls that will affect him psychologically. We are talking clearly about the undocumented. These are walls, big walls that difficult them to learn the language, to progress to a social level. We will talk about that later with more detail, like we mentioned earlier. Then we're going to talk about the indicators, the criteria, to see when we will consider a simple situation or a complicated situation. At the very bottom, the whole scale is based in 2 or 3 ideas that are repetitive. And once these understand the basic idea, then it's very easy to understand. We have here the scale, how it is used, and we can see the 7 griefs. In each grief, we are going to have to evaluate what vulnerability does the person have, and what stressors this person has to confront in the country that he has gone to. Valued as simple, complicated, and extreme. And those are the 7 griefs. One can understand the image, basically. Some aspects of which we will talk about. We've talked about observations, 4 things that the scale doesn't measure, but that we will try to acquire through observation. Why does the scale doesn't measure everything? Because if it did measure everything, then it wouldn't be scientific. You'd have like a magic ball or something like that. The scale cannot measure all of reality. It will measure aspects that we consider that are significant. And if you could do that, that's a lot. Science cannot measure everything. We cannot do it. So it is important to see where are the areas that the scale doesn't measure. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to take them into account. We will try everything. We will do an observation so that when we do the global evaluation of this immigrant, we see the whole thing of the situation of this person. Now we will explain it with more detail. Now we have to talk about the small wording, the indicators. How do we measure that reality of the patient? When it's simple, when it's extreme, we will try to do an example so you can understand it. Indicators are of reality that help us with the evaluation of these elements of vulnerability in relation to the stressors. So then we have in these elements of vulnerability and stressors, the vulnerability stressor, there's the physical one, diseases, limitations, physical limitations that the immigrant has. A man that migrates with a heart problem or different disease, these are physical problems or diseases, but we're also going to see this mental disability. The person has a phobia. All this is vulnerability. We are also going to see the history that the person has had, because it's not the same thing. It's not the same person that comes from a life without difficulties to a man that comes from a country in war where he has led violence, threatening and dangerous. All this has affected him in some way. So from the theories that I have mentioned earlier, all of that is vulnerability. That's why I have insisted so much in explaining these theories, because I limit myself to theories. In back of me, I have all this conceptual information that allows me to do this. The people that had lived traumatic experiences, very hard times, this leaves a scar. So you could call this vulnerability. And so these are the indicators of the scale. What do we measure in the indicators of the stressors? There are the personal stressors of the person when it comes to family or friends. Fundamentally, social stressors. What difficulties does the person have in the work environment, culturally, etc.? Which are these walls? I think a stressor would be like a wall, difficulty to have success in life. We are talking about something extreme. So then, I will give you an example that is very clear. Let's talk about the language. There are 7 griefs, but I will give you an example of one of the griefs. And let's talk about the language grief. I think it's very important. You will be able to see it more clearly. Vulnerability to the grief in regards to language. What are we measuring? Because we want to make sure what is it that we're measuring. We have to go back to the manual to see what we're measuring. We are measuring only. It's not a little thing, but that's what it is at the moment. The limitations that the person has, the limitations of the subject that he had before migrating that could make preparing for migratory grief difficult are assessed. That's all we're measuring. Before migrating, this person had some difficulty, some problem, but then when he migrates, this could hinder his success when it comes to language. So what would be vulnerability? Simple vulnerability. In a physical level, small limitations, linguistic limitations that we all could have. Some people cannot pronounce the R very well or the S very well. We understand each other, communication, or psychologically. There are people that they have friends, they have relationships, but they are not the kings of the party either. They communicate in some way, in a moderate way. All that is simple vulnerability. With that, being that the case, the person could have success when that person goes to another country when it comes to the language of the country that they went to. So we go back to the chapter of vulnerability, complex vulnerability. Let's talk about let's say this person has a problem with hearing. Maybe the English, phonics, a little bit different from Spanish, to learn English. Eyesight problems, to be able to read. All these are difficulties to have success in general work. But if that person finds in a favorable environment, instead of learning something in 4 years, maybe it takes them 9 years, but it's not impossible. Just on a psychological level, the person that migrates with depression, with social phobia, with certain mental disability, it's going to be hard, but the person can accomplish it with the resources, with patience. The person will learn the language. Some people will migrate with dyslexia or other medical problem. The language, so this person needs more attention, but it's not an impossible thing to have success in the new change. We could also take into account people that have lived very difficult situations in personal story. Maybe a child that has lived in a very violent environment. Maybe he's limited cognitively. We could also consider that as complicated vulnerability. And then a person migrates being very old, maybe 80 years, changing a language somewhat complicated. Nothing comes in. One doesn't learn. The neurons don't work the same for so much. That would be a complicated vulnerability. But if he puts effort, he could also learn. So what's extreme vulnerability? It's a person that migrates in extreme situations. This is going to be an enormous handicap to be able to have success. As an example, maybe the person doesn't hear absolutely nothing. The person has an accident that involved his brain. The cognitive part is going to be hard. There's going to be impossibilities, or psychologically, mental disability, very extreme. This would hinder any type of learning. So, are you understanding this? How the scale picks up all this reality situation in relation to the immigrant. So then you have the simple and complicated. So then you mark according to what characteristic you see, and we will continue. There would be the social grief. The person migrates with the problem with the heart will have limitations to work. Well, the person that is healthy, the person would be able to work. But a person who has a heart problem, any day he could die. There's simple vulnerability. There's the simple one, the complicated one. Heart problems, but they could be overcome. And then there's vulnerability, the one that is extreme. It's the type that you can't even go forth one more step. So now we're going to see this immigrant, how the scales measure once he gets here. He's here now. Now we're going to see when he has arrived. So which would be the stress factors that the person lives, and how do we identify these? We're going to be measuring the obstacles that this person has in relation to the learning the English and understanding this new language. What would be simple stress factors? Small limitations that have always existed in the means to be able to do this change. Nobody has 24 hours, like the professor that speaks English or the friends, and slowly the person will learn the language. The simple stressors would be that the conditions are not perfect. This would be not only to a family level, to a social level. What are these complicated stressors? Maybe he doesn't know the English. He works so much. It's really difficult for him to learn the language. Works many hours in a place that he doesn't learn English, he doesn't have time to go take classes, and he doesn't put effort because he's tired. But if he puts effort, what are these extreme stressors? We are talking now about an immigrant that has these walls that will hinder contact.
poco contacto con la población anglófona, pero es que además tiene el mundo y contacta con ellos.
He works all day. He is in fear, he is scared. He cannot attend the school courses because they will be asking for documentation. Therefore, we are talking about an external reality that is limiting the immigrant for him to be successful. So we are talking about really various situations. So then if that's the case, if he is in the extreme, if that's the intensity of the stressors, then we indicate that in the box under the extreme stress. Now, we will not be talking in detail about all the griefs because we would be here all day, but the scale has a criteria for each and every one of these griefs, and we follow the same pattern that we have gone through already. Very well. Evidently, we must have a questionnaire. At the beginning, I would say we really have to have that history that the immigrant has lived, all of the information and data that we have and that we are able to get through the scale. The scale will not be asking any odd or weird or out of the ordinary issues, only what we want to know about the individual to see how the individual is doing. Meaning that the questionnaire will not be asking any odd or out of the ordinary questions. We should have already a history, a personal history of the individual, and we have to know what are the difficulties and what illnesses. Otherwise, we will not be able to diagnose. Therefore, the questionnaire then helps us obtain information of each and every one of the griefs. But as I've said, I believe that this should be considered. And but we do the questionnaire to make sure that nothing has skipped, that we have gotten everything. It's not just a waste of time, you know. It's not like 2-3 hours trying to it's the basic information that we've obtained that we now are structuring in a scheme. It's not that we're looking into new materials or difficult ways. When the subject is under a certain test or you know, it's not that way. We're not putting the subject under test, under questioning, really we should have the basic biography of the individual and personal history. So we structured this. I will comment briefly on these 4 factors that we see underneath the scale, under observations that the scale does not measure, but that we must take into account, because this is part of the reality that the immigrant lives. The scale cannot measure this because we cannot measure at the same time one thing and another. The scale only measures problems. We are looking for what are those negative stressors that he's going through. So what are the 4 elements that we have to get down under observations to understand the reality of the immigrant and where he is at risk? First of all, the observations are protective factors. We've spoken about problems, but the immigrant may also have certain personal qualities, for example, maturity, intelligence, or maybe social skills. All of that will help. Or he may belong to a group support that is providing him with that support religiously and politically. And that's very important. That does not mean that will resolve all of the problems that he has. If I have a debt with the bank and I owe money to the bank, you know, having a social group doesn't mean that they will solve my debt. So we are talking about problems, yes, that he's facing, but elements that protect. Yes, observations are protective factors, so he can then overcome the stressors. Under the scale, we would have to we would have to write down, well, these are the vulnerabilities, these are the stressors, but he also is part of a religious group, and this is very important for him. They provide support. We also take that into consideration, and we value that. Very well. Secondly, what we call aggravating factors. We must take into consideration that when we are measuring the stressors, meaning the problems that the immigrant is facing, we measure these according to, we measure this and we focus on the last 6 months. You know, we can't measure this forever, therefore the stressors, if he's sleeping on the streets, if he is alone, we look into his situation for the prior 6 months that he's lived. If he now has a better situation or relationship, but he's lived very extreme situations. So these aggravating factors are really the difficulties that the immigrant has experienced since he immigrated, from the day he left his home up to the 6 months prior to the visit, assessing the scale. So if the immigrant, there's an example of an immigrant who is now legal but was undocumented for a year ago, you know, he probably is not facing the same stressors, but we should take that into consideration. The scale also has observations of subjective factors. Yes, as I said, we have our theories, our scientific theories, and we see the subject from our point of view, but the subject can have a totally different interpretation of what he's going through. I've seen cases, a lot of people sometimes say, well, oh, I don't have my children with me, but that does not really worry me. According to our theory, that is something in which there's a concern, because I have all these theories backing me up that says that if a father is not close to his children, you know, there can be issues that arise, problems, concerns. I remember there was a case of the social service office. There was a man who was living on the streets, and I said, oh yeah, I live on the streets, but I enjoy it. You know, I'm perfectly fine on the streets. You know, he was perfectly fine with this sleeping and living in the streets, but according to our theories, that is not the case. So see, that's what we're trying to really interpret here. There's different issues that are seen according to our point of view and the subject's point of view. And then on the other hand, we also have the fourth observation, which is a cultural focus. Yes, the cultural focus. In the culture, there's everything. If you like the food from California, no, that's not where the culture is. The culture is the way that they live, their family life, etc. Does the culture then have a certain influence in the griefs that we are evaluating? For example, it's not the same. The family separations, or the family that is living in a clan or a group, or a single mother, a single father, the culture is really being influenced in the way that the individual is living the grief. And this is also something that is taken into account in the scale. Now we are going to talk about a case, analysis of a case, and so we will try to measure this in a more specific way with all of the dialogue of what we've said. For example, there was a man, Juan, a 28-year-old man who left Ecuador. He was healthy. He was a strong person. He had no mental illness, and he was a very valued person in his community. And he had been in Spain for 2 years. But his symptoms were sadness and crying anxiety, recurrent thoughts, headaches, insomnia. But he was someone who was working, had no ideas of death, no apathy. So we put aside the symptoms, and we have the scale there. And he left behind 2 children, age 6 and 4, who he cannot see, and he has not seen in a long time. He cannot bring them to Spain because they do not have legal documentation. the family rupture. He has no legal documentation. He works when he can in an irregular manner in construction, in a very, very clandestine and very dangerous job. He continually changes his lodgings. He sees no solutions to his situation. Sometimes he's having to live on the streets and he can hardly send any money back to his family. He's had a large death as a consequence of this, without any protection, in a very hard job, dangerous job. And he was also detained several times because he has no documentation, and he no longer can go back to Spain because he has a large debt that he can no longer pay. So if he goes back to his country, he is faced with this large debt. So he's living under very big stressors or stress. So this is very in alignment with the Ulyssess syndrome. He has such magnitude of problems, even though he's working, but he's sad. It's not that he's depressive. He has a certain activity, dreams, projects. He has no idea of death. But it's not a depressive patient. So how is it that we apply the scale? Well, the vulnerability, we consider that it's a simple vulnerability in the 7 griefs. He can immigrate anywhere he wants. He's healthy, he's strong, with background of having the ability. Like we said, the humankind history is of successful migrations. We are capable. We have the ability of migrating. We've seen so many people who have been successful, but who now face these large barriers and walls. So the vulnerability, in his case, we consider that it's a simple vulnerability because language, culture, work, and family area, he is able to overcome this in a healthy way. He is not at high risk, and he should not have difficulties. But Juan has these barriers that are considered the stressors, extreme stressors in the family life, because he is separated from his family, from his young children. He has not seen them in a long time and will not see him for quite a while. So those are the extreme stressors in the family field. Now in the language barrier, well, he speaks Spanish and he would not have issues because it's the same language of the country of Spain. But if he immigrated to California, then he would have a language barrier because he would have to learn all of the new language that's spoken here. And in regards to the cultural area, there is an extreme stressors because one cannot communicate with the natives, with the locals, or just sing or be part of the society because he is undocumented. He can be expelled. He hides, or he can be deported. So we see extreme stressors also in regards to the land. There are simple stressors when they immigrate to terrible places. For example, if someone is immigrating to a country where it is an extreme winter weather, which is dark and cold, so obviously then you would have to face a very difficult situation psychologically. But when you immigrate from your land to a country where you have no issues with living there because of the weather, it's a welcoming as a place. So in regards to social status, we would have extreme stressors because he is undocumented. He cannot find a job in good conditions. He cannot find a housing. All of those are extreme stressors. Then in regards to the group here, he has not lived situations of, if he has lived explicit situations, he could have lived, I slept on the streets and a group of individuals beat me, then that would be a very extreme stressor under the peer group. And also the physical risk, because he was detained, no personal protection, helpless, works under very dangerous situations, has fallen, has had accidents at work, has threats of being taking his life. So those are extreme stressors. So we have the scale here. Green is a symbol. Yellow, complicated, and red extreme. So green symbol, yellow, complicated, and red extreme. So now we have here the scale, how we've evaluated him, with the risk in which he is at. What does this mean? One has not vulnerability. He has the capability of facing this stress, but he is living extreme stressors, and I think this is where we should take a moment to really reflect on the fact that even though he's sad and he has headaches, he should be referred to a psychiatrist, a psychology, the recommendations are of those who are vulnerable, at high risk. We are able to take a lot of stress, but if we are vulnerable, then we will not be able to overcome. So the scale shows, and the finding shows, the vulnerability of such individuals and stressors. If there is no vulnerability, then the individual can go to social services, psychosocial programs and social groups without medicalizing, and so we're able to upbuild his and fortify his. Now, what would happen if Juan would have had a previous depressive condition? Then under this context, he would be at high risk because he has lived traumatic situations. Now, these grievances that he's living stressors, and have the factor of risk. We never know how things are going to end. So as a factor of risk, one should communicate and be in contact with social services. Hopefully he is never at risk or nothing happens to him. So, like I said before, what we do is just like as an insurance company, we see the risk. We can't see the specific risk of each individual. You know, this gives us really an approximate of where he's at. There's people who are smokers the entire life and they never have a flu or a cold, and others who are super healthy and get ill. So as a risk factor, we really know, we can't say for sure that concretely that, but a doctor might say that a heavy smoker might be at a high risk, meaning that the vulnerability is always there, but the service, the attention that we give, we have to take into consideration all these criteria. Like I said, taking into account all of the theories that back us up. So this is a little bit the way the scale works, and the scale lets us see where are the stressors, and therefore, like we said, where is it that we have to intervene, how do we intervene, and really save resources, use them in a way that are proper, do not medicalize. And I think that way the social services department, that they are more equal in the way that they provide their services. And I think that both things should take into consideration for the functioning of providing that assistance. So we have compared cases of a woman who is vulnerable, complicated vulnerability, grief because of her family. And she did not have, she had ideas of death, and she was always in bed, and the stressors were complicated because the vulnerability was high. Vulnerability with high, complicated stressors, we should look into
estar al
prevention
tanto de que el caso pueda
and know
realmente
that that case
complicarse todavía más a nivel psíquico. Pero si
be
no
a
hay esta
complicated case.
vulnerabilidad, yo creo que se puede
And if
buscar
this vulnerability is
una
not
ayuda. No
there,
hay que
then
dejar
we
a la
can
persona sin ayuda,
look
pero darle la
for
ayuda adecuada.
assistance and
Es una
provide
ayuda
the adequate
psicosocial,
assistance,
de overnight,
psychosocial,
de apoyo,
empowerment,
Porque
that
si
support,
intervenimos
because
médicamente,
if
pues
we
incluso
intervene
acabaremos
medically,
generando
we will be
problemas
generating
secundarios, con
secondary
infecciones,
problems.
infantilizándole.
And if we
Todo
are,
eso es negativo y es un
all
gasto
that is
además enorme
negative,
de
and
recursos.
also
Luego,
we are
los
wasting
servicios
resources
asistenciales
if we
están
do that
súper
in the
saturados,
social
pero la mitad de la
services.
gente que vaya tiene
It's
Entonces,
they're so
utilizar fatal los recursos.
busy with so many cases, so we take into consideration each criteria to see how, when, and how to go about it. There are certain areas where we do not have to intervene. There's no stressors, no extreme stressors.
Podemos operativizar mejor la intervención. Bueno, entonces la escala
So
nos
the
permite ver
scale
cuántos duelos hay,
will let
en
us
qué
see
área está el
how
problema, y
likely,
apuntar
where
también,
is
como
the
decía antes,
problem, in
los
which area,
factores
the factors,
de tipo las observaciones.
and the
En el
observations. And you have the book there, right?
En el libro sobre la escala, pues por ejemplo,
On
en el
the
caso Juan,
scale, for
que está más
example,
desarrollado
on
que
Juan's
aquí, pues
case,
se pone que Juan era un hombre religioso,
was
que
a
estaba
religious
vinculado
man,
a una parroquia en
and he
Barcelona, y
was
esto era un
part
ejemplo.
of a
Dentro de su soledad,
neighborhood in
dentro de
Barcelona,
su sufrimiento, pues,
and
había un
even
grupo
though
en el
under
que
his
se
suffering
escuchaba,
there was
se
a
sentía
group
comprendido.
whom he communicated and he felt understood,
A la hora
a
de
very
analizar
important
el caso,
factor
pero la
when we
escala no lo
analyze
simplemente es
the
una observación
one
que hay,
case. It's just an observation that we
es
had.
limitada
The scale is
en lo que
limited
observa,
in
pero,
what it observes,
lo
but
que es importante es ver si
what
lo
is
que está
important is
observando
that
lo
we
hace
take in
bien.
consideration
El verdadero,
and observe it the right way
objetivo de la escala.
and
Bueno, pues
in an
más o menos era un
objective
poco esto
manner.
lo que
So
quería plantear,
this is
porque
what I wanted
no se
to
trata tanto
really
de
put out.
intervenir por intervenir,
It's
sino de
not so
intervenir con
much
unos
about
criterios que sean
in the
coherentes y que
intervention
sean
right away,
Muchas
but
veces
that you
se interviene
intervene
por buena
in a
voluntad,
proper way, in an appropriate way, and because it's necessary. Sometimes we do it
no se están,
with all heart,
criterios
but we have to
operativos
take in
y
consideration
científicos, todas
the
las
scientific
condiciones
criteria,
para
the
hacer
co-op
una
criteria,
intervención que sea,
so that we are
positiva para
able
el
to bring about a positive
Pero esto
intervention.
está en este libro que
And
la Fundación
This is
tiene, y es posible
found
que
in the book,
hagamos incluso una edición
and maybe
con
we
la
will
Fundación
do
del libro
a
que podría estar a disposición
we will
de todas las personas interesadas en
have,
trabajar
if you are interested in
con
working with
este
us
modelo que
and
está
working with
utilizando
this
en otros
model
países,
that is being used in other
creemos que es
countries,
interesante, pues,
we
para
we
intentar
think it's
trabajar lo
interesting
mejor
to try to
posible
work
en estas situaciones tan
in
dramáticas
this dramatic situation that we are facing.
Tenemos, por ejemplo,
For example,
bueno, si esto está en castellano, porque el libro está en castellano.
this
Ahora estamos
is,
haciendo la traducción.
so we are working in the Spanish English translation because the book is only in Spanish. So they're working in the English translation right now, and they hope that the book will be ready by spring. So we see here all of the different grievances very well, and this is our email as well and our info. If you are interested, our contact information, we're an entire network, an entire group. It's important to share the information and the data to really keep researching into this. So I don't know if there's any questions, comments. I know that we only have about 5-7 minutes, but if you are, feel free to ask anything, or if you have a comment.
I do want to mention too on the foundation website, which is, we're working at getting a new one, but right now it's natividadfoundation.org, and we'll be posting lectures 1, 2, and 3 on our website, so you can go in. So if you've missed the first 2, please feel free to go on. Give us a couple weeks to do that, but it will also be in English and Spanish on the website. And we've talked about putting it on YouTube or Facebook or something like that too. So just keep in touch with us. And if you need copies to show, we videotaped every session again. So just email me at the foundation, lford@natividadfoundation.org, and I'm happy to supply that because we do want to get the word out about this. But Dr. Architegi, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Any questions? We have about a couple minutes. Maggie.
Hi. I was just interested in learning how widespread
Es interesante aprender el uso de la escala. Oh, no está prendido, creo. ¿Qué tan esparcido está el uso de la escala? ¿Quién más lo utiliza aparte de ustedes?
Sí, bueno, como comentaba, pues en España hay varios.
Well, like I commented, in Spain there are several investigation groups, and like I said before, it is being used in El Peru with those immigrants who are going back to their land of origin and still keep living stressors with their social life. It's also being used in Japan and France. So we have a network. And also we've tried to compare the differences among the stressors from one country and another country in the context of what the immigrants are living. If we have a larger group to work with, well, then we are able to investigate more. Tengo una pregunta. Con este síndrome que usted ha hecho mucha investigación, así que usted sabe las peculiaridades detrás del síndrome. ¿Hay alguien que tenga el síndrome de Ulyssess y depresivo a la vez? Y si así es, ¿cómo hace para tratarlo?
Sí. A ver, tal como señalábamos.
Well, just like we pointed out, Ulyssess syndrome is a multiple stress syndrome, chronic syndrome, a reactive stress, different from a patient who is depressive, a mental illness. So at the beginning, they are not compatible one with the other. If someone is depressive, then if someone is in depression, they have apathy, thoughts of death, and do not have the capacity of working, of social intervention. But Ulyssess syndrome, its symptoms are people who have headaches, sadness, they're concerned. But they have dreams, they work, they have projects, they want to continue and progress. So it's really an extreme situation that they're facing and living. So I think there is a great difference.
Mi pregunta es sobre qué podemos hacer para ayudar
I
en
want to
médicos de
know
familia
what is it that we can do
escaso que tenemos de 15
with the
minutos por
limited
cada paciente.
resources and the limited time, 15 minutes to see each patient. How can we help the patient and his family, especially when you are faced with factors that we cannot change, like the vulnerability and the stressors? It's really the society in which we live in that has brought these. So how can we help the patient? What is it that you're doing to help families right now? I think that the first thing we have to take in consideration is try to see if we are willing to help, but we don't want to rush. We don't want to confuse stress with depression. We don't want to treat this in a negative way, because if we treat him as a person in depression and start medicating him, then that would be a negative way to respond. First, stop and analyze. What is the psychological and pathological condition of the patient? Once we are aware of this, under the Ulyssess syndrome, what we do is that we have programs in which we empower and we try to provide the individual with the resources that are going to help them to live and overcome those stressors. If he has problems with sleeping, we can help him how to better sleeping habits. We teach our children, right? But sometimes that habit is lost when we are full of stress. We're unable to sleep, lack of sleep for years. Imagine. So now we can teach him sleep techniques that will aid and help him with his sleeping. For example, if someone is isolated and has difficulty with socializing, teach him social techniques, communication skills. Or protective factors. Go to this neighborhood, go to this church. Are you Muslim? Are you Catholic? There is a church, a religious church, that will help you. All of those are elements that reduce stress. The Ulyssess syndrome is like if we were in this room with 100 degrees Fahrenheit, we would start feeling symptoms and the heat, but we would decrease the temperature, and so it's not. So we can try to provide them with resources, with relaxation, breathing techniques, social networking, role play. That will help to bring that 100 degrees down, or those stress levels down. But it's not the same to be under 100 degrees and 50 degrees. Now, if the immigrant has a mental illness, depression, psychosis, then we will have to provide him a psychiatric treatment. If he has a mental illness, taking into consideration all the cultural background, and you might know that we have to intervene then if that's the case with the clinical studies, and with taking in consideration the cultural competency, and provide with therapy, psychotherapy, with medications, everything that patient needs if that's the case. It's easier to prescribe Prozac than to listen to the patient. It's easy to say the problem is resolved, but we have to really be aware of the suffering that the patient's going through. Yes, that is true. That is what we should try to really, find a way of avoiding that way of treating the patients. I think we should have more of a systematic way of helping the individual instead of medicalizing or with medications or prescribing. We should have a social groups, and we know that's a struggle, a complicated struggle that we all face.
Ustedes saben, los Estados Unidos ahora, especialmente en el sureste de los Estados Unidos, tenemos un cambio en la situación de los inmigrantes.
We are facing with a change with immigrants. Before, it was really easy for immigrants to come and go, to immigrate and then go back to their land of origin. But now it seems that has changed. It is much more difficult for them to go back. Do you think that we should anticipate having an increase in the Ulyssess syndrome among our immigrants? I believe so, yes. The Ulyssess syndrome is related to extreme stressors with a response of the suffering of the subject, and if those stressors are going to increase, then if there's more persecution, more stressors, more hardships, then the walls are now higher. Like I was explaining yesterday in our lecture, between Greece and Turkey, they are constructing a wall, a bigger wall. See, those walls that are being built are causing more stress. So then the anguish and the suffering is increasing. And in healthy individuals, he might not be at risk, but others might be faced with the Ulyssess syndrome.
Sorry, one more question, Doctor. Is in your research,
En su investigación, ¿cuántos inmigrantes confiaron en el sistema de salud y de qué manera ayudó usted a esos inmigrantes a que confiaran en el sistema de salud? Porque no es fácil para ellos compartir su sufrimiento con alguien. Puede ser que estén hasta cierto punto bien, pero... Yes, it's a very relevant issue. Immigrants have to face a lot of barriers in the medical and health department. Sometimes there's a security guard and they're even scared of that. But there's other barriers, cultural barriers, language barriers. They're not going to understand me. They're just going to prescribe medications.
o no conocen siquiera la
or
existencia de los servicios.
they are not aware of how the health system and medical system works. They're not knowledgeable. They ignore that. So now we have all of these barriers. For example, lately we've seen less people that come and seek the medical and health care. Why? Because there's more walls, more barriers. They are hidden. They don't even have money for transportation. There's those barriers are various barriers, and I think that you have to work with the cultural aspect in order to, they distrust because they don't understand why they're being given a pill or what the pill is for. So I think you have to really take into account the cultural and linguistic aspect.
Just both of you, and could you come forward for a minute? We have a little